stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary? Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest? Where is purgatory in the Bible?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
We welcome you into Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders, and we are answering that very question. What is stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Perhaps you were raised Catholic and you, for one reason or another, left the church. Perhaps you were raised in another evangelical Protestant tradition, and maybe you've thought about the Catholic Church but didn't know that much about it, or knew more than you thought you wanted to know, and maybe there's one particular point that is kind of tripping you up. We would love to talk to you about that today. The phone number to be on the program is 833-288-EWTN, and that's toll-free anywhere in North America, 833-288-3986. If you're outside the United States and Canada, we'd still love to hear from you. Your number is 1-205-271-2985, and we will put you straight to the front of the line at 1-205-271-2985. You can always send us an email, ctc@ewtn.com, or you can even text your question to Dr. Anders. Text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for a response. Text your first name and your question. Message and data rates may apply. I'm Jack Williams, sitting in today for Tom Price. Michael Birchfield produces the program. Our call screeners, Mr. Ryan Penny, and Jeff Burson handles our social media endeavors. So if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook Live, type a question into that chat window and we may get to it by the end of the hour. And our host, as he is every day, the one and only Dr. David Anders.
How are you, Jack?
You know what? If I were any better, I'd be jealous of myself.
So, feeling a little split personality today?
No, I'm great.
Good.
Fantastic. As always. Like I tell people when they ask me how things are going, I work, literally my office is, as the crow flies, probably 50 feet from the tabernacle in Our Lady of the Angels Chapel. So how bad could things be for me to be within 50 feet of the Blessed
Best answer to
Sacrament?
that question, I went to grad school with a guy, you ask him, how you doing today? He would always say, I've been worse.
Well, there you go. We've got a text here from Titus. And he wants to know, are you ready? Are you ready to put your...
Titus is appropriately named, by
That's
the way.
exactly right. Are you ready to put your Father Mitch
ready, yep.
linguistic hat on? He says, how are aorist and second aorist verbs handled in Bible translation?
You're going to love my answer. It depends on the translation.
Oh, well, there you go.
Because there are different translation philosophies. And basic division in philosophy of translation is between dynamic and formal equivalence. Do I want to try to understand the sense of the writer and then put it in as readable and colloquial form as possible? That'd be dynamic equivalence. Or do I want to try to stick as close as possible to the literal word and tense that's under consideration? That'd be formal equivalence. Different translations veer to one or the other of those extremes. Obviously, the more you veer towards dynamic equivalence, the more the translator's own interpretive paradigm comes into play. But you can't avoid interpretation in every translation is an interpretation, but with a longer or a shorter leash. I prefer a formal equivalent translations because once you immerse yourself in the biblical text, you begin to gain a familiarity with biblical idiom, with biblical expressions. And they're easier to do word searches and cross-references against, passage to passage and this kind of thing. When you look at dynamic equivalent translations, and I've seen, just not trying to pick on Protestants here, but I did all my biblical studies as a Protestant, so that's where my frame of references come. The very same word, same kind of phrases will be translated very differently in two different texts, and it's obvious that something like Calvinist theology is controlling the translation because they don't want to render the literal sense of a text that would contravene some Calvinist dogma, And I mean, Catholics will do the same thing, right? But I've seen it. I've got in my head some examples with words like justification, for example, the way they're rendered in different contexts. So I like to stick as close to the actual Greek text as possible, and then trust on biblical commentaries and my good sense and experience to try to figure out what the dynamic equivalent is going to be for me.
Well, with translations, just like with even history, whenever you get humans involved, there's going to be some measure, no matter how small of bias, that are going to be involved in what you're reading. Sure, yeah. So the aorist is like any other Greek tense. I mean, it's a past tense. It's just a vanilla, it happened, Yeah. Beautiful. We also received a text from John. We're going to cover all of the New Testament names here. Why did the Mass after the Second Vatican Council lose so much mystery and beauty? Was this a hermeneutic of continuity or rupture? Well, that's a subjective judgment about your experience of the Mass, right? And a person can argue that case. I think the two terms were mystery and beauty. That's right. If by mystery you mean lack of transparent intelligibility, like I walk into Mass and I don't know what's happening, therefore it's mysterious, that was kind of the point of the Reform, was to make the Mass more transparently intelligible to the faithful. Now, if you talk to people who grew up before the Second Vatican Council, before the change in liturgy, there are very clearly people of two minds on this. And I have talked to folks that say, we lost something essential. This was beautiful. I mean, why did they throw away a good thing? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, you'll hear that. Then you'll hear people that said, man, I'm so glad they changed that thing because I was sleeping through the whole thing. I never understood a word of what was going on, and I never connected. I've heard both narratives. In terms of beauty, it's, again, you'll hear 2 points of view on this. I know diocesan priests in Alabama who are of an age to have celebrated the Latin Mass who said, when we did it, or not we, they're not naming themselves, but they said, I know my confreres go to a daily Mass, man, they were ripping through that thing as fast as they could to get to the end of the consecration. I mean, low Mass, no singing, just let me just chant through this thing as fast as possible. Not very beautiful. Kind of a functional, utilitarian view of the old Mass. Then you can go to a Schubert Mass, you can go to a papal high Mass with Palestrina going on with beautiful cathedrals and gorgeous smoke and incense everywhere, awesome vestments. I've had the same experience today. I've been to Masses in the New Rite that are just astonishingly beautiful and reverent. I've been to some that were real duds. 833-288-EWTN is your ticket to the program. That's 833-288-3986. This is EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Couple of phone lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Our leadoff hitter today is Andy in Boise, Idaho, listening on Salt and Light Radio. Andy, you are on with Dr. David Anders.
Well, thank you so much for taking my call. I really do appreciate it. I guess I'm old enough to have forgotten more than I know. I know I knew the answer to this question, but I didn't want to get it wrong. So the question is, how do Adam and Eve populate the earth?
In the normal way. So, the question of monogenesis, which is the doctrine that the human species today is descended uniquely from a single pair, poses certain philosophical and empirical scientific challenges. Theologians offer different solutions to those problems that are, within the realm of the allowable in terms of speculative theology. There is an article that treats some of these difficulties and offers a possible solution by a theologian named Kenneth Kemp. The title of the article is Science, Theology, and Monogenesis. It's readily available online, but it's a nice introduction to that difficulty. The website Thomistic, Thomistic, Thomistic Evolution, which is a ministry of the Dominicans of the Eastern Province, is another one that looks at some of the scientific difficulties posed by the doctrine of monogenesis and proposes the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas as a tool to bring theology into dialogue with the natural sciences. So I'm going to leave it at that for the time being. There are some empirical difficulties with understanding the current gene pool in relationship to the doctrine of monogenesis. There are some creative ways of dealing with that problem, and I would direct you to those sources for a real scientific analysis.
833-288-EWTN. That number is toll-free anywhere in North America. We've got a couple of lines open for you at 833-288-3986. Kathy is watching on Facebook Live. She said, could you please describe acedia? I'm having difficulty returning to the church after illness. God gave me a blessing, and I'm frozen in indifference.
Yeah, I'm just too tired to describe acedia right now. I'm going to pass that one. No, teasing. So this is one of the 7 deadly sins of spiritual sloth, and acedia is not physical exhaustion. Mononucleosis.
This is willful decision.
Right. It really doesn't. Laziness is a different category. An unwillingness to put in the extra 5 minutes on the treadmill, or to pull out those 3 last reps in your bench press. That's not acedia. It really is the vice of not directing ourselves in our lives towards the spiritual disciplines that guide us to God with intensity, with intention, with diligence. And we all experience this. Everyone has it. We all know that we ought to pray. We all know that we ought to pray more than we do, and we don't. No, that doesn't mean there aren't some real heroes in prayer. There are, all right. But the vast majority of us recognize that this is a good. It really is kind of the essential part of our spiritual life. None of us give the attention to it that we need. We all make excuses because we've got to binge watch those last 30 episodes of our favorite rerun TV show.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number. Grab one of these open phone lines at 833-288-3986. That's what Renee did in San Antonio, Texas, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Renee, you are on with Dr. David Anders.
Thank you, Dr. Anders, for answering my question. And sometime this week, you were saying that we will have flesh and blood bodies in heaven. So I was just wondering, after the resurrection of the dead, how will we recognize miscarried babies or all young babies and children? My niece wanted to ask you, will God let her pick the color of her eyes and hair? And I just wondered, are we going to meet everybody there? And will we love everybody the same? Like, will I love every man and woman there as much as I love my own mom and dad?
Okay, thanks. Great questions, all of them. I'm going to... What we know about the beatific vision, the life of heaven, and the resurrection of the body, you can fit in a thimble. Scripture defines these things for us and whets our appetite, so to speak, gives us some expectations, but leaves a lot of things unsaid. So a lot of what I'm going to say in answer to your question is just speculation. And I will be the first person to, if we get there, where, God brings us to the end, we persevere in the faith, we get on the other side, and I look around, I'm like, man, this is nothing like what I told Renee back in March of 2019. You've heard it from me. This is just me doing my best to think about logically the answers to questions that Scripture and tradition just don't answer. All right. What do we know for a fact? The key blessing of the next life is the beatific vision. It is the perfect knowledge of God. And because God doesn't have a body, God is not a concrete material object, our knowledge of Him in this life is remote. We reason to God as a cause from which we can derive effects. We know some things that sacred Scripture or tradition have said about Him, but we don't know God in His essence. We don't have the tools to come into contact with God in His essence. But sacred Scripture teaches that we will know Him even as we are fully known, that we will have an intuitive knowledge of God, an immediate intuitive knowledge of God in our souls that will ultimately satisfy all the longings of our heart. And if we're knowing God in His essence, we're going to know a lot of stuff. So the first answer to your question, I think, is God knows the identity of every human person. And if we can see all things in God, it's not going to be any trick at all for us to be able to recognize every individual that's in heaven and by name, and we retain our own personal histories. When Jesus saw Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration, everybody knew it was Moses and Elijah. I mean, these are recognizable types. And so we carry to heaven with us the record of our good and bad deeds in this life, and they have an effect on the rest of eternity. So our personal history, our personal narrative will feed into the experience we have in eternity and our identity therein. So we'll be able to recognize people in their personal identity and carry with them those past histories. And I think that goes to your next question. Will I feel the same about my spouse in heaven that I feel about, the dog catcher next door? You will perfectly love the dog catcher next door because there's nothing lacking to us in heaven. But there will be qualities to your relationship to your spouse that will not be found in your relationship to the dog catcher. You're going to love both people perfectly, but it's just like today. You have two great friends. You said, who do I love more? I can't answer that question. Or maybe your own children. Somebody said, which kid do you love more? You don't do it that way. I love all my kids equally. I love all of them differently. Because love is a reciprocal thing, and it's predicated on a past history together. And those histories are never the same between two people. So with the dog catcher, it'll be like, man, you were a dog catcher? That's awesome. Let's talk about that for all eternity. Or maybe not. And then you're my husband. You're my wife. That's so cool. And I'm going to love you in a way that's appropriate to the identity and the relationship that we've had, but perfectly. Can I pick my hair color? I see no reason to expect that, but I will tell you this. You don't like your eyes. They're blue, you want hazel. They're brown, you want black. Man, you will have the most beautiful blue eyes. If you're blue, it's going to be blue like you've never seen blue before, and they will leave nothing to be desired. I kind of think you're going to keep your eye color. And the reason I say that is that it's your body that's resurrected. And you're not just a soul stuck in a body at random. Like, God had a assembly line of bodies, and he was like, let's just put her in number 27. It doesn't work that way. You really are. Your identity, your individuality is connected to your bodily identity. But that bodily identity will be perfected. Good buddy of mine I mention all the time on the show, who's a quadruple amputee, lost his arms and legs when he's 7, 8 years old. He's not going to be a quadruple amputee in heaven. And so he'll have the body that grace and nature intend for him to have for all eternity. Be the same person, but glorified after the manner of Christ's glorified, resurrected body. And everything about it will be perfect, lovely, beautiful, and enjoyable.
I think the most comforting thing you can say to anybody on this topic is, I promise you, if you get there, you are not going to be disappointed.
You're not going to be disappointed. Yeah. Right.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Next up is Richard in Poplarville, Mississippi, listening at EWTN.com. Richard, thanks for holding. You're on with Dr. Anders.
Oh, thank you for taking my call. Dr. Anders, I'd like to ask you, one of the homilies on EWTN a few weeks ago was about the killing of Abel by Cain. And it was brought up at that time, where was Adam when all of this was going on? And then also, why was Cain so worried about the opinions of other people with a mark on his forehead if there were so few people in existence at that time?
Thanks. I appreciate the question. So, first of all, let me back up and just consider the purpose of Holy Scripture in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. These are not just curiosities about the ancient past, the way we might read a narrative about, some ancient Alexandrian physician. And we go, well, that's interesting. That's how they practiced medicine back then. It's not like that. These stories are archetypal. They are allegories. They may be more than that, right? They're not only that, but they're allegorical and spiritual to capture universal human experiences, temptations, longings, aspirations, virtues that stand as models of the right and the wrong way to do things for all eternity. And so when we read these books, we're to identify with Cain. We're to identify with, oh, I'm like that in this respect. I'm like that in this respect. These stories have universal significance. So they're not there just to satisfy our curiosity about some episode of past history. And in such, the sin of Cain is one that we all identify with, I think. How many times have I wanted to bring down somebody who was more successful than me at doing good because I resented their own perfection because it made me more aware of my own imperfection? Or how often have I resented the disparate circumstances that what would seem to be chance has thrown into our lives? Why, and that's the cry of the psalmist too, why is this guy thriving when I'm so much of a better guy? Or however, but we all experience that, right? In terms of the context in which the book of Genesis was written, marking somebody out as an outcast and a criminal is a real threat to their social well-being, right? Particularly in a culture that doesn't have a legal system or judicial system, and the only form of justice known is the vendetta. I had a young man the other day who's kind of a tough, likes to settle things the old-fashioned way, say to me, man, I would have been so good in the Middle Ages. Just call a duel, get it over with, and we'd be done, That's the way it used to be for everybody in the whole world. So these are the kind of considerations that we would bring to bear in understanding the book of Genesis. Within the scope of the narrative itself, the questions that you ask just aren't raised. So where Adam was, Earth was a big place. Adam could have been anywhere, we're talking about grown men here. If my brother and I go and have a fight, we're not going to wait until Dad's around to do it. And then who are all these people? Again, the narrative itself suggests that there were a lot of people. There were cities, right, with which Cain would have to contend. What's the time span? How much time has elapsed from their expulsion from the Garden of Eden? Doesn't say. Long enough for there to be cities. Again, just within the context of the narrative, not looking at, the archaeology and the paleontology and all that. The narrative says these guys lived hundreds and hundreds of years. You can do a lot of business in a few hundred years.
833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Those numbers are toll-free anywhere in North America. If you're outside the United States and Canada, we'd love to hear from you. Your number is 1-205-271-2985, and we will put you straight to the front of the line at 1-205-271-2985. You can always send us an email. Email us at ctc@ewtn.com. That's ctc@ewtn.com. And you can also text your question to Dr. Anders. Text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for a response. Text your first name and your question. Message and data rates may apply. This is the season here in the springtime where you're seeing a lot of First Communions, you're seeing a lot of confirmations, and things like that. And what greater place to find that perfect little something for that special person in your life that may be going through one of these milestone sacraments than EWTN's religious catalog. Mother Angelica always thought it was very important that we surround ourselves with what she called holy reminders. It's also important that we catechize and educate ourselves. You can find all kinds of things to do just those things at EWTNRC.com. That's EWTNRC.com. You're listening and watching Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. (833-288-EWTN) is our toll-free number. That's 833-288-3986. If you're watching on TV, you can join the conversation by sending us an email, ctc@ewtn.com. at EWTN.com. Back to the phones we go. David is right here in Dothan, Alabama, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. David, thanks for holding. You're on with Dr. Anders.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anders. I really enjoy your show.
Thank you.
I had a question regarding the Apostles' Creed. It's maybe a two-part question, but one, I'm during Lent, I'm saying the Rosary daily, and so I've been pondering the Apostles' Creed, and was wondering if the Apostles' Creed preceded the Nicene Creed, and then by the second part of the question, in the Apostles' Creed, it says that he descended into hell and on the third day rose again and is seated at the right hand of rose again from the dead. So I guess I'm not sure what they mean, rose again. It suggests that he
Sure. I can help you with both those questions. Thank you for asking them. In the ancient church, before the 4th century, creeds were almost always associated with the sacrament of baptism. And there are hints of this even within the New Testament. In Mark chapter 16, Jesus says, "Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved." And Paul talks about confession with the mouth and being saved. So the idea that one would make a verbal profession of one's faith at the moment of Christian initiation, i.e. baptism, deeply embedded in the biblical texts and in the earliest strata of the church's tradition. And when we find enumerations of the rule of faith or the list of things that Catholics have to believe, they're always associated with these baptismal creeds. One of the oldest baptismal creeds that we know of, the most august, was called the Old Roman Symbol. And symbol is another word for a creed or a statement of faith. And it was the baptismal creed used in the Church of Rome in the 2nd century. And that is the basis for the Apostles' Creed. That's why it passed into the Latin Church, because ours is the Western Church, and Rome had the strongest sway in Latin Christendom. When the Council of Nicaea met to decide the Arian question, the heretic Arius had denied the full divinity of Jesus, and there was a big debate raging about precisely how to define the doctrine of Christ's divinity. How is the Son related to the Father? They wanted to come up with a statement of faith that would be universally accepted by Catholics everywhere throughout the world and impose it on the universal church as a normative statement of Christian belief. It was natural that they would reach into the language of these baptismal creeds to find the base text. And so, first drafts, if you will, were different bishops from throughout the world said, well, this is the one we use in our church, and well, this is the one we use in our church. And they settled on one, and then they adjusted it as necessary to specifically anathematize the Arian heresy. So that's the relationship. Now, in terms of the translation, rose again, in Latin, of course, it's resurrexit. It's just a single word. And the rose again is simply an idiomatic translation of that one singular act of resurrexit in Latin. Now, in linguistics, an idiom is a phrase that has a meaning that is somewhat different from the literal sense of the words. Well, the meaning of the phrase, the idiomatic meaning of the phrase rose again, is he got up and walked out of the tomb. It doesn't imply that he did it more than once. He only did it once, and that's what the phrase captures. You could say, well, it's an infelicitous translation. Okay, fine, but it's also fairly traditional, and I think it reflects the R-E, S-U-R-R-E-X-A-T, R-E in Latin, meaning, the prefix meaning again. That's how it got worked out that way. People that were maybe a little overly literal in the way they handled the Latin language, but there's no theological significance to the again part other than he just got up and walked out.
I always wondered how you say it's raining cats and dogs in Aramaic.
That's a good question. It's raining camels and fish?
There you go. 833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. We received an anonymous text, and the question is, why did the Catholic Church switch the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday?
Well, we didn't exactly, because we don't celebrate the Sabbath. Sabbath was a Jewish holiday, and the New Testament is fairly clear that Christians are not to be Sabbath observers in the same sense. And in fact, St. Paul says, absolutely do not let anybody judge you with respect to Sabbath observance, because this is a shadow passing away with the entire Mosaic law. New moons, Sabbaths, all liturgical feasts of the Jewish calendar, not going to go there, not what the Christian faith is about. And so what happens on the Lord's Day is different than what Jews did on the Sabbath. Of course, the Jewish Sabbath, if you go back and read the Ten Commandments, is a day of rest. That's what it is. Right? It wasn't a day of worship. Every day in the Jewish calendar was a day of worship. They offered sacrifice in the temple every day. They rested one day a week in imitation of God, who rested on the last day of his creation, and also to give servants and people like that some time off. Now, what do we do in the Christian church? We worship God every day, just like the Jews did. We offer sacrifice every day, like the Jews did. We offer the sacrifice of the Holy Mass every day. We also recognize the principle that it is right and just for laborers to be given time off to pursue religious duties and other things that need their families and so forth, and that's actually a principle of the natural law. You don't even need revelation to know that. If you work people to death, they die. So we give people time off so they can do some R&R. Leisure is really the basis of culture, as Joseph Pieper once said. It's necessary for the human person. And to a certain extent, there's also an analogy in the idea of waiting till God finished all his work of creation and then taking a day of rest as a model for human behavior, because the Christian doctrine, the New Testament doctrine, is God recreates the world in the resurrection of Jesus. This is the beginning of the new order. And so the first day of the week is really the first day of the rest of the story. And so we hallow and celebrate that day, and Christians have from the very beginning celebrated the day of the Lord's resurrection as a special feast. It's the oldest feast in the church. It's not precisely just like we kicked the Sabbath one day forward. That's the wrong way to think about it. Rather, we're celebrating the recreation of the world in the resurrection of Jesus, and Christians have always done so. But those other things about giving people a day off and offering sacrifice and worship on a daily basis, we still do that.
Next stop, Marion, Indiana. Wesley's in Marion, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Wesley, what's on your mind today?
Well, thank you for taking the call. I love to listen to you on Sirius Radio in my car when I'm driving.
Thank you.
I was listening to the conversation with the woman with the acedia, and I was thinking perhaps she's forgotten grace. That if grace is grace, it would be moving. If she understood grace to be as big as it is, it would be moving her out of that. You said we all know we ought to pray. If grace is grace, then doesn't that change the ought to a magnificent opportunity? So the specific question is, how does grace work in healing from these maladies? And the other one would be, since we are under the new covenant, in a sense, shouldn't we or don't we have the opportunity to concentrate more on grace than on the oughts and shoulds? Because all of those oughts and shoulds have, by grace, become magnificent opportunities. Have I rambled too much, or can you pull a question out of that?
I think you've got several threads of reasoning that are tied together, so let me try to unpack them a little bit and respond. Clearly, grace is operative in our confrontation with all of the wounds of original sin. All right? Because of original sin, we have wounds in our nature that incline us to do the wrong thing. We have egotism, we have malice, we have concupiscence, we have ignorance. And these manifest themselves in the 7 deadly sins: pride and sloth and lust and gluttony and anger and jealousy and all the rest of them. And grace comes in and heals our nature and enables us to be healed from those wounds and overcome those capital faults. And you know the virtues that are infused into our life along with grace: faith, hope, and love, prudence, temperance, and fortitude, and justice, and all the rest of them. They are the antidotes to these things, and we grow in them as we cooperate with grace. So we have the infused virtues, but we also have the opportunity to consciously cooperate, to perform acts of virtue, and as we do, we're strengthened in that. We are cooperating with grace. God gives more grace, makes it easier to live the holy and Christian life. You talked about the contrast also between the alt and the opportunity. I think, personally, my view, I think it's a little bit overblown, that contrast. The church has laws, and God has laws. There are precepts, both of the natural and the revealed law, and they're there to guide us in those opportunities. So one of the reasons the church mandates that her children go to Mass on Sundays and holy days is precisely to help us form those habits of cooperating with grace through worship. I mean, if acedia is a disinclination to pray and worship God because we'd rather just lie on the couch and, eat bonbons, the church is saying, no, you have an obligation to get your tail up out of bed and go do it. And look, I've been on the road before, away from my home parish, away from my friends and family, and I look in the phone book or whatever, and there's some parish I've never heard of, and some priest I don't know, and some town I've never been, and I've still got to make it to the airport. And have I ever gone to Mass just out of that obligation? Of course I have. Now, that's not my general motive. I go because I want to be there and worship God and to receive the Eucharist. But look, I confess, I've gone to fulfill my Sunday obligation, and good for the church for making me do that. So the obligation and the opportunity flow together. All right, because the obligation, what the church says, St. Thomas, my favorite theologian, says sin is nothing other than an inordinate act. It's an act against reason. It's an act that actually harms us. All right, so the law, basically God commands, be happy. Not your concept, your limited concept of happy, but what I can tell you about happy. Go do that. Go do those things that are going to tend to your absolute and ultimate flourishing.
So many times in a situation similar to what you just described, when I may have acted out of obligation more than out of charity, God seems in those moments to overwhelmingly show me his grace. Yeah, sure. When you need it most. That's exactly right. Thanks so much for that phone call, Wesley. We appreciate it. The number to be on the program is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Next up is Fred in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, listening on Holy Family Radio. Fred, you are on with Dr. Anders.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate the opportunity to ask a few questions. This is pretty fundamental, at least for me. I absolutely believe that God is all-knowing, knew everything before and now and everything into the future. So my question is, a couple. Did God know that the angels would fall, and did God know Adam and Eve would fall before those things took place?
Yes and yes. He certainly did, and God created,
and every other possibility that could have happened. Right, exactly.
He could calculate all the betting odds.
I learned that from you, by the way.
So why then did he create a universe in which he knew with certainty that sin would enter in, because he intended to make use of that human fault to bring about some greater good? And you say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, actually, it does make a lot of sense, and we have analogies to that in our own experience all the time. How many parents have consciously allowed something to happen, allow their children to do something that they knew was not a good idea, because they could foresee that I can use this for this child's, I'll let them make this mistake, and it'll be an opportunity for them to learn something of tremendous value. All of us, I think, if you're any good, unless you're a helicopter parent who micromanages, which I've also done, you will do that, So we have analogies in our own experience all the time. And maybe sometimes you don't see the good that God's going to bring out of it. But that doesn't mean he doesn't see the good. And Jesus said, there's more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who don't need to repent. That's an astonishing thing to say. That there's some kind of beauty, virtue, or value in the turning of a soul from evil to good that is different from the great value of a soul that's never done evil. They're both amazing, but they're different in their quality, and because God's a great artist, he makes a beautiful universe that contains both kinds of beauty.
Was it Thomas Aquinas that said that God would allow bad things to happen for one of two reasons? One, you just articulated, that a greater good could come out of it. The other being, if I'm not mistaken, that it could be averting an even greater tragedy.
Are those subdivisions of the same category?
They're, I don't know, kind of opposite ends of the Q-tip, maybe?
I mean, Thomas is one of many theologians who gives that answer, that God allows evil so the good may come of it. I mean, that's the standard theological answer. Yeah. And you can start enumerating the kinds of goods that you might think of. One of them would be averting greater evil. Sometimes, in individual cases, it is actually to inflict punishment on the wicked, because sin is its own punishment. And it could also be the one I alluded to, which is the unique good that is a converted soul. And I'm sure we could come up with several more, too.
Yeah. Well, one great good that we can offer
Lost leaders and marketing.
Yeah, well, there you go. One great good that we can offer is the opportunity for one-stop shopping when it comes to news from a Catholic perspective, and that's the Catholic News Agency. They gather some of the best of the Catholic blogosphere and editorials and articles all to one site. You can find that at CatholicNewsAgency.com, a division of EWTN News. That's CatholicNewsAgency.com. 833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Next up is Christine in Greenville, South Carolina, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Christine, you are on with Dr. David Anders.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking my call. So my question is regarding cremation and the Catholic viewpoint, and then a second question that I thought of while I was reading was, could you address things that we do, choices we make in our life that modifies our bodies, and kind of the Catholic view on things like breast implants and cosmetic procedures and that sort of thing?
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question. So, traditionally, Catholics were forbidden to cremate. They are now allowed to cremate, but they are dissuaded from doing so. And there are situations when you don't have any choice. It could be concerns of finance or what. There'd be a lot of reasons, but it's better not to if you can, because it's more commensurate with the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. It is, however, no problem for God. God knows what you looked like, and God knows every particle of matter from which you were constructed, and He is certainly able to reconstitute your physical body in its glorified form from a single atom if He wants to. So it's not a problem for God. He can do it. He can resurrect us even if our bodies are cremated. Traditional view is that He is going to use some of the particular matter that constituted our physical body. Maybe not all of it, but He'll use some of it so that there's some continuity with the historical person. But that's a theological opinion. It's not a dogma. And but from our point of view, yes, you can cremate, but you cannot do so for superstitious reasons. The law disallows cremation for superstitious reasons. So you can't go cremate somebody and scatter their ashes on the Ganges in imitation of the Hindus and their belief in reincarnation. That would be a superstitious reason, a wrong reason to do it. And, I had a friend die this fall I'm very fond of, and I've already been twice, 2 or 3 times to his grave. I don't think he's there, but I'd like to be in physical proximity to his body and think about it's going to get up one day and walk out of that tomb. And I pray for his intercession, and I like to be in proximity to his relics when I do so. And that's a good motive. That's the proper way to think about the remains of our loved ones.
Well, their existence in and of themselves are a reminder for us to pray for them.
Precisely.
Yeah. 833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Next up is Frank in Buffalo, New York, listening on the Station of the Cross. Frank, you're on with Dr. Anders.
Dr. Anders, I hope I can get this to you in a cogent way. You might have covered it a little bit with Wesley's call before, but it's about Orthodox Roman Catholicism, and what I see as the attitude of the people in the pews. It's almost become like a test, if you will. It's like a punch, ABC test, or if you will, or an obligation thing where people do what they do because it's almost like they're ordered to. That you go to Sunday Mass because they have to. It's a day of obligation. Instead of out of a spirit, like Wesley said, of charity. It seems to me that my Protestant friends who I talk to a lot, they ask me why we're so uptight about all these things, and why with the Protestants it's almost like just come on over to the party and jump in the pool, and everyone's invited. Where the Catholics are, well, you got to take this test first, and you got to do it in triplicate, and dot your I's and cross your T's, and if you're good enough, then maybe we'll let you on the patio. If you know what I'm saying.
Sure.
I'm wondering,
I'll speak to that, Frank, and I appreciate the question. I'll speak to that as a convert to the Catholic Church because I've been in both camps. I became a Catholic for one reason only, was for authentic relationship with Jesus. And nothing else about the church mattered to me other than that it could bring me into a deeper and more authentic relationship with Christ. First, for me, that meant a proper doctrinal understanding of who God was and what his will for me was in life. I reformed my thinking about my relationship to him. And look, if you don't have the right idea about someone, you can't have an honest and authentic relationship with them. You can have a relationship with a fiction, but it's not the person you're actually dealing with. So it reformed my thinking about God and about Christ. Then Christ gives me tangible, objective signs and tools and instruments of entering into a spiritual, invisible, but powerful relationship with him, and these tools are called the sacraments. Above all, the Holy Sacrament of the Eucharist, when I encounter Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity. This is not about passing a test. It's not about crossing a T or dotting an I or anything. This is about consuming Christ in the most intimate way possible, and is for many people the primary motive they have in becoming Catholic, because they believe Jesus' words, if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have life. And I could go on, if I had more time, and say the same thing about all of the sacraments. I love to hear the words of absolution from a priest. I absolve you by the authority of the church, through the ministry of the church, that is the body of Christ. Receive his grace. This is an unbelievable experience, and it's all about intimacy in the deepest and darkest places in my soul. So it's all about relationship with Christ. It's also about life in a society, because God does not simply call me to a private relationship with him like my own personal Winnie the Pooh. He calls me into a family that's 2,000 years old and 1 billion people strong. And, of course, every family does have rules. Well, sometimes they can't enforce them. I was always trying to get my kids to sit down to a white tablecloth dinner and, pass the mustard politely. That was always tough to do. But I recognize the value in it, and expectations about how people are going to treat one another and behave. You have to. Otherwise, you can't function coherently as a society. So it doesn't bother me, it doesn't offend me that there might be rules and regulations governing the way Catholics conduct themselves in that society. Now, as human beings that are prone to sin, can we get our priorities out of whack? And can you walk into a Catholic community where you feel like, well, there's too much emphasis on following the rules and not enough on, this confrontation with Christ and the sacraments? Of course. Let me tell you something. That's true of every religious community. Now, when I grew up in a tradition, evangelical Protestantism, that promised all this deep personal intimacy, away with all rules, it's all about me and Jesus. Let me tell you something, buddy, that can be as formulaic and artificial as you can possibly imagine. Do you know how many times I invited Jesus into my heart when I was a little kid? Like 50,000, okay? And we used to sing a song in Bible camp, one door and only one, and yet its sides are two. I'm on the inside, on which side are you? The kind of divisiveness and sectarian hubris that can characterize what is supposed to be all about love and relationship, and it really becomes about sectarian challenges to my identity and power politics and cults of personality. And I'm not saying that's everything. I'm just saying you can have dysfunction in any kind of religious community. So I'm not going to judge based on the worst examples. What's the intent of Christ? What did Jesus leave for me to know him? And in spite of objective difficulties that can emerge in Catholic life, it still remains the church that Christ founded with everything that we need for life and godliness.
You've got a minute. Katie in San Diego, California on YouTube wants to know what Jesus looks like now. Is he spirit and body?
Well, yes, of course. And he will be embodied for all eternity, because the second person of the Trinity assumed a human nature rose again from the dead, ascended into heaven, and awaits us in glory, and we will enjoy him forever in that way.
David, thanks for your time as always.
Jack, thank you.
On behalf of our host, Dr. David Anders, our producer, Michael Birchfield, call screener Ryan Penny, and our social media maven, Mr. Jeff Burson, I'm Jack Williams, again sitting in for Tom Price. Thanks so much for tuning in to EWTN's Call to Communion. Until we get together next time, God bless.